Hello, everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about computations. After all, this is a class about computation, introduction to the theory of computing. And so we better understand what we're talking about. And I did my due diligence and I looked at the definition of computing from the dictionary. And it says to find out something by using mathematical processes. And this is not a perfect definition by any means, but there are some stuff about it that I like. For example, talking about processes, emphasizing the dynamic aspect of computations. But more than the thing that I like about it, about what's in the definition, there is something that I really like about what's not in the definition. So what's not in this definition? Anybody? Yes, computers. This is a definition about computations that doesn't have computers in it. And after all, aren't computations just the byproduct of computers? The things that computers do is computing? Well, this could have been a way to define computations. But if that was the case, then we'll have to answer what kind of computers? Perhaps this computer that is similar to the computer my son has, or this computer that's not very different, or just a little bit older than the one that I got for my undergrad, or this computer, which even I am not old enough to remember, or perhaps your laptop, or one of your smart devices that exist now, or any of the smart devices that are being developed all the time and contain more computing powers than this room of computers that existed in the past. So which computers would we use if we want to define computations through computers? And if we do define it this way, then the notion will be very temporal, because every time a new technology would come out, we will need a new definition of computers, a new notion of computations, and a new theory altogether. And we want something, we want a definition and a theory that would be stable throughout technological progress. And indeed, we can have one, as I'm sure you'll be convinced by the end of this class. But if we are going to define things through computers, then we might as well consider these computers. After all, the notion of computers actually preceded the digital computers and referred to humans whose job is to do computations. And if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, it tells the story of Katherine Johnson, who was a computer that received recently the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was a very important computer. And indeed, this shouldn't surprise us that computers and the notion of computation preceded digital computers, because we are doing computations ourselves all the time. When you're watching this video and you're processing the word I'm saying, you're performing a very, very sophisticated computation. And even babies, when they're trying to do the very basic things, like some games, like kind of trying to push a block into a box and moving it and banging it until it gets in, are performing an algorithm after all. So we've been doing computations ourselves all the time since we were born and keep on doing it now. And there are algorithms that we have actually spent time to learn. So for example, this algorithm for long multiplication is an algorithm that we all learned in roughly third grade of school. And we know it throughout our life. So we've been doing algorithms all the time. And indeed, it wouldn't be very surprising to note that algebra was born in computation. So even the name algebra and the name algorithms come from a very similar, very related source, which is the work of the famous and great Persian mathematician, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Kharizi. So the name algorithms come from the Latin mispronunciation of his name, and the name algebra comes from one of the operations he introduced. So what he tried to do is to suggest ways of solving linear and quadratic equations algorithmically. Instead of dealing with each equation on itself, he was suggesting a way or ways, methods, operations to help it to solve it systematically. In other words, algorithmically. And if we're mentioning algebra, we should be fair and mention geometry, which is also has its roots in algorithms. So in ancient Egypt, the most fertile lands were the ones near the Nile. And every year with the floods, the separation between the different plots would change, would disappear. So they had to use working knowledge of geometry to algorithmically create the plots again, to separate the plots again. And indeed, even this kind of video that you see here should remind you this straight line and compass method that you've learned in school, which is a computational model. We can ask in this model that allows you to draw straight lines and to use a compass, what things can be computed and what's not. So for example, you can have an algorithm to split an edge to 3 parts. It's an algorithm in this computational model that has these basic operations. And I'm sure you heard the saying that you cannot square the circle. This can be viewed as an impossibility result, a computational impossibility result. In this model, given a circle, you cannot create a square that has the same size as the circle. So this is perhaps one of the earliest impossibility results, computational impossibility results you are aware of, even if you didn't think about it this way. So let's look at computations in a much wider eyes. And let me give you a definition which is roughly taken from Avi Vigderson's book that I'm going to recommend to you on the webpage. And essentially the definition he gives is that computing is the evolution of an environment through repeated applications of simple local rules. This is more than a definition, this is kind of a framework to understand definitions, to understand computations. And each computational model that we'll discuss in this class can be viewed as formalizing what is this environment that we are changing, evolving, and what are the simple local operations that are allowed in this environment. But looking at it so widely open us to understanding many more phenomena as performing or being a form of computation. This gives rise to an area or of research that's known as the computational lens. Many of the top computer scientists and even complexity theorists in recent years have been working in areas that are typically not associated with computer science. They've been working in areas like biology and physics and even social sciences. And in each one of these areas, there is something that the computational perspective brings. So one area that was one of the first to adopt the computational lens is biology, and in many, many areas. So obviously, it's not hard to imagine the brain as a computational device. But beyond that, many parts of biology operate like computation. So for example, many things inside our bodies, inside our cells, operate as computations. For example, protein folding is a sort of computation. You have the protein, which is your input, and your output is a different representation of this protein, a folded representation. And one interesting thing about it is that we know that in general, protein folding is hard. And since we don't expect our bodies to compute things that are hard to compute, then it brings the question of what's special about the kind of proteins that we are folding, our bodies are folding, that allows the bodies to do it efficiently. Another example of many is evolution. So evolution really fits very nicely into this idea of evolving environment through lots of simple local operations. Our DNA has been evolving over the decades, and it's true that that we don't need this understanding to define evolution. We can define it without thinking about computations. But once we think about computation, it allows us to ask questions about efficiency, which are very relevant. So the question that's really important is not whether or not evolution, a particular model of evolution, could create a human from a single cell, which is, of course, very interesting and important question, but a more refined question is it likely that, or could this computation be done in the time that it happened? So if in principle, some computation can lead to a human, but this would have taken more time than the time we had from the start of the universe, then definitely this is not a good model of evolution. Other areas like quantum and physics in general, statistical physics and other, have also adopted the computational lens. And I've heard statements from physicists, I'm not a physicist myself, that the quantum computing has really shed light on some major questions that physicists have been interested in, and is one of the most exciting development within physics, beyond the fact that it is kind of exciting our computer science world. But I want to say that the computational lens is also very, very relevant in other areas that perhaps are not immediately associated with computations. For example, in the social sciences. So perhaps you heard about 6 degrees of separation, which is the idea that between any two individuals, let's say in the US, there is a path of length most 6, such that with 6 steps, with 6 hops, you can reach from one individual to the other by following connections that exist. So I know somebody that knows somebody else, that knows somebody else, that knows somebody else, all the way to knowing any individual within the US. This refers originally to an experiment. And one interesting thing about this experiment is that the experiment actually demonstrated not only that these short path between two individuals exist, but that they can be found efficiently. So the experiment gave letters, and each individual sent a letter locally to somebody they know, and so on and so forth, until they got to their designated address. And so by somehow following this algorithm, we can find short path, and that understanding that it's not only that these short paths exist, but they can be found efficiently was an observation that led to some really beautiful and amazing research in kind of computational social sciences. And the last example I'm going to give is that of markets. And one thing that markets do, they kind of compute prices, right? And what economists have been suggesting are various important and beautiful solution concepts. And these solution concepts like equilibrium try to predict how people will behave in these kind of markets. But an observation that was the beginning of this important area of algorithmic game theory is that it's not enough that these solution concepts exist. For example, that an equilibrium exists, but if the market is to behave in the way that produces this equilibrium, if this solution concept is to predict how people behave, then it has to be efficient. So it's not enough that an equilibrium exists. An equilibrium should be able to find it efficiently, to compute this equilibrium efficiently, because if we cannot compute it efficiently, then the market would not compute it, and this equilibrium would not represent the behavior of the market. So this is an entirely beautiful and exciting area, the computational lens. I'll give you some reading materials, but unfortunately I will not be able to talk much more about it. I will be able towards the end to give you something about the way in which the computational lens, or taking computation into account, taking computational limitations into account, change our perspective on some very, very basic notions. So we'll definitely talk about how the computational perspective changes the notion of a proof. We all know what is a mathematical proof, something written on paper that you can verify. But computations and computer scientists have introduced different kind of proofs that are much more powerful. And they did it through introducing interaction into the world of proofs, by introducing randomness, but also by introducing computational limitations. So if through interactions I can convince you of something, and I cannot convince you of something wrong, then this is a proof. But it should be convincing even if it's based on the fact that I'm computationally limited. So perhaps if I was computationally unlimited, I could do whatever I want. I could still cheat you, but you know that I'm computationally bounded, and that allows you to believe my proof. Similarly, the notion of knowledge has been really changed and we'll mention this beautiful notion of zero knowledge, a proof that convinces you of something without giving you anything additional, any additional knowledge about how to actually prove it. So you're convinced of a statement, but you don't know more details about it. You don't learn anything more. Now here too, the information that you want to seek may exist within the proof, but because you're computationally bounded, you will not be able to extract knowledge out of this information. Learning, which we'll talk a little bit, is now viewed as a computational task. And this again allows us to talk about what can be learned, what cannot be learned. Randomness is a computational resource, and we'll talk about how randomness at times adds computational power. And then the notion of entropy changes through this computational lens. For example, entropy can generate more entropy, can grow. So a truly random string cannot turn into a larger truly random string, but it can turn into a larger string, which we call pseudo-random, which is effectively random and is larger. So pseudo-randomness is a way for randomness to increase on its own, and we'll mention that as well. before I complete this idea, I would say that, and again, this is a slide I stole from Avi Victorson. This understanding of the power of computation and the way in which computer science and theory have gave us the tools and language to talk about computation brought about a significant power to this theory of computing. So the thing that we'll discuss is this very basic core of computation, of the theory of computation. And this does interact with many other areas within the theory of computing, algorithmic game theory, pseudo-randomness, distributed computing, communication complexity. We'll touch upon some of them. We won't mention some others. There are great classes in Stanford that I'll try to recommend to you. And this entire theory of computing and the theory community has been able to give a lot or have a large impact on various other areas outside of computer science. Mathematics, statistics, social sciences, biology, physics, economics, and more. Yes, thank you, thank you. Indeed, this is a beautiful and powerful picture. Thank you very much. And kind of in conclusion, I want to say that what I hope I kind of gave you the taste here, and perhaps I'll give you more throughout the class, is that computation is a very powerful notion, and the theory is giving us language and tools to reason about computations and to talk about things that can be computed or not, things that can be computed efficiently and not, and what are the applications of all of those. And I hope that within this class, we will have fun with these notions that are really at the core of what computer science is. So thank you very much.